It's lovely to see you all here this morning. I hope you enjoyed the first day and are going to enjoy the next 2 days with us as well. A couple of quick housekeeping remarks or reminders. We have a bookshelf set up in the viaduct, the long read, which is what this Republica is about. So if you have books at home that you would like to share, or you would like to go browse for a new book to take home and read, the viaduct is the place to go. And of course, we also have our Moby Dick reading, which is going on throughout Republica, and you're welcome to join. The idea is for you to read a section from Moby Dick, and whenever a person makes a mistake, the next person continues reading, and I think a lot of people had fun doing that. So be sure to check out those two motto-related things. Anyhow, my name is Geraldine de Bastian, and I'm part of the Republica program team, and it's my honor not just to open the stage this morning, but also to moderate the upcoming panel with the title, The Digital Identity Revolution, Great Hopes or Deep Concerns. Now, identity is a concept that the majority of us here in the West or in so-called developed countries take for granted. But according to the World Bank, 15% of the world population, more than 1 billion people, lack a valid form of identification, a figure not even accounting for the 60 million displaced, 21 million refugees, or 10 million stateless persons. So with the rise of different digital identity solutions, new ethical questions are rising as well, and different possibilities. And those are what we'd like to talk about today. Those ethical questions around identity, around self-sovereign identity and different technologies in use, and the concerns around them. I would like to first of all welcome the host of the session to the stage, Frau Julia Lehmann from the Bundesministerium für wirtschaftliche Zusammenarbeit und Entwicklung, our Federal Ministry of Economic Development and Cooperation. Julia Lehmann is currently heading the Division for Human Rights, Gender and Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities at the Ministry, and we're very happy to welcome her at Republica today.
Good morning, everyone. Very early hour this morning, but on behalf of the German Federal Ministry for Development Cooperation and the GIZ, which is our implementing agency, which implements our projects all over the world in all the different partner countries we have. A warm welcome. I'm a bit blinded by the light, but I hope we can still interact with the audience later on, even if it's hard to see you. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. As Geraldine has already said, we all take identity for granted. We all think, we don't even think about this anymore. We all wouldn't be here if we hadn't been able to register with Republica this morning. We all had to take out some form of identity card this morning to register here to actually get entrance. But as Geraldine said already in her including remarks, 1 billion people in this world do not have any form of identification they can produce. This is particularly relevant to contexts of migration, of flight, of refugees. And a lot of them then, especially in refugee camps, can't find a satisfiable answer to the question of who are you? I mean, we often regard the question, who am I, as sort of, a metaphysical question, but for a lot of people, it is actually a very factual matter, the question, who am I in terms of how can I identify myself and how can I lead a life that is based on some form of identity. Digital identities have opened up new avenues, and we will hear later on, especially from Andrew Harper from UNHCR, how that has helped to register refugees. But of course, with any kind of digital new revolution, there's always a question of human rights concerns in the sense of the right to privacy, and the right to your digital identity. And of course, you can imagine it's not hard, and you don't really have to engage in any kind of conspiracy theory, but you can easily imagine that identity data in the context of refugees and in the context of migration, if that gets into the wrong hands, you can easily imagine what that amounts to. Also, of course, to other government agencies who seek surveillance, or even imagine you've deserted from war, or you're part of a persecuted minority, then of course those data in the wrong hands can have a very, very detrimental effect. In all of our development cooperation we do as the German government, we pay one of the fundamental principles is the respect and regard for human rights, and that's not only offline but also increasingly online. And a lot of you have heard of Agenda 2030, that includes the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been agreed within the United Nations in 2015. One fundamental principle there is leave no one behind. Leave no one behind means human rights accord to everyone, every single one, especially very vulnerable groups. And in the context of migration and refugee and flight, of course, those groups are very vulnerable, and their human rights, especially also their right to privacy and digital identity, have to be respected. Part of that we're trying to do through something that has been very much debated and has gone through the media over the last few months, and that's the Global Compact on Migration. The Global Compact on Migration has the great advantage to actually comply with human rights standards and actually explicitly state that any action taken under this Global Compact has to be under a human rights-based approach. And also the Global Compact for Refugees, which is the lesser debated but second compact that fits into that area. In those, all governments are obliged to respect human rights, and those, of course, include the right to privacy and digital privacy. But today we've got many speakers here who know much more about this than I actually do, so I'll limit my introductory remarks to simply now welcoming the others and thanking you very much for having us, and thank you for being here. And I'm very much looking forward myself to learning a lot more about digital identity and where that balance is between the great benefits of identifying people but also protecting their human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia, for the introduction, as well as for bringing this panel and this topic to Republica this year. So I would like to now welcome the three panelists that we have invited excuse me, to discuss this topic with you. I would like to bring on stage, and please give them all a big round of applause, Andrew Harper, Zara Rahman, and Balazs Zemeti. I'd like to give them all a bit more of a detailed introduction so that you know who's on stage with me today. Andrew Harper is the Director of the Division of Program Support and Management with the Office of the UNHCR in Geneva. And prior to this current task, he led the Innovation Service at UNHCR and was leading and coordinating the international response to the Syrian crisis in Jordan. And of course, we'll be speaking more about your experiences there and your work in this panel. Zara is the Deputy Director of the Engine Room, an international non-profit organization that supports civil society to use tech and data more effectively. Zara researches responsible uses of data and technology in advocacy and social justice, and the relationship of power and technology. She has written about identity and technology for outlets such as Daily Dot and The Real Life. And to my right, Balazs Zemeti is an expert for the Economic Forum on Digital Identity, part of the Digital Identity Task Force, Good ID. He has been a core contributor to the driving topic in the decentralized identity globally, so bringing forth a discussion with the World Economic Forum and other fora. And his company, Taquanu, Taekwon is focusing on creating solutions in decentralized identity that can deliver privacy by design for systems for the developing and the developed world. Thank you very much for being here together, the three of you. As you can see, we have kind of a distribution of expertise on the panel. Andrew has a wealth of expertise actually working in refugee contexts and managing so-called refugee crisis. Zara with her expertise on digital ethics, and you as sort of the practical implementer of digital identity solutions, and that's very much sort of the focus of the discussion we want to bring in. For the format, I'd like to start off by asking each of our panelists like a mini interview set of questions before engaging together in a discussion and also bringing all of you in. It is kind of hard to see you, but we know you're out there, so if you want, please don't be shy, and we're looking forward to you joining this discussion. Andrew, I'd like to kick off with you because I think it's important to give everybody the right kind of context, exactly what we are speaking about. In the midst of one of the world's largest refugee crises, or perhaps the largest refugee crisis, you established Satari and Azraq, two refugee camps. I'd like to begin with a question how identity matters in exactly these contexts of your work. Perhaps you can give us a little bit of an insight what importance the right to identity has in those spaces and for people living there.
It's on. So thank you very much, Geraldine, and thank you everyone for coming this morning. It was a massive effort in regards to the Syrian operation, and it wasn't just obviously one organisation or individuals alone. And we were there in order to support the government of Jordan, the population of Jordan, who were having their borders kept open for tens of thousands of people coming across. So actually, we were getting about 5,000 people per day coming across. In order for Jordan to control the situation, because you must remember that Jordan is in a pretty rough neighbourhood. They've had to deal with Iraq, they've had to deal with the situation in Syria, they had Palestine and Israel next door. So security and the credibility of the operations were their foremost concern. And so for them, they put in place a registration system even before we came in play. And so we worked with the Jordanian government to ensure that the registration system that the government put in play, and they already were looking at biometrics, took into account the needs of the populations and were done as effectively and efficiently as possible. So in many aspects, this is where the world is also going, that governments are taking more and more responsibility for registration, and UNHCR and other agencies are just trying to ensure that the best practices are put into play. And so in relation to the digital registration there, we found that one, providing people for digital identity provided them access to territory, which was the most important element, so they were not being bounced back into Syria. But two, when they had a digital identity, that allowed them to leave what was basically closed camps. So they were able to leave the Zatri and Azraq, because no matter what people say about refugee camps, they're still refugee camps, and no one wants to be in a refugee camp. So this gave the confidence to the government to allow refugees to leave the camps and to relocate to urban centres. We were then able to use, just to be very quick, we were able to then use the digital identity, the biometrics that we captured from the refugees with their concurrence to be able to access everything from cash through ATMs, and then link that up to assistance which is being provided by a host of other organisations and agencies. So what we'll probably be discussing here at great length is how secure is the data, and what was the willingness of the refugees to come forward and be registered. If you're dealing with refugees who've been suffered so much in Syria for some substantial time, the feeling was that no one would come to UNHCR and register because the refugees themselves would be concerned about what would happen with the data. They didn't trust anyone. They'd suffered a great deal from the previous regime, and so to come forward and register and share their experiences and their details, people would say this wasn't going to happen. But very soon after we started, we had thousands of people come through, and so that was a demonstration that people wanted to be registered and they wanted to avail themselves of protection.
That's a very important point you make because, as I said in the opening remarks, we take these things for granted, and the sort of apprehensions that we feel people might have to give the data, as you said, upon registration, sort of in the practicalities, if one finds themselves in this situation, of course, the benefits of doing so completely outweigh, and there's probably not much choice that people have. So the fact that you had people queuing up to do this with all the things that you listed that they would get access to if they did so, of course it's clear that people would want to, right? But I'd like to, just recap quickly: access to territory, freedom of movement, access to resources, some of the points that you outlined that of course you need to prove yourself and show some form of identity for. Now, you introduced biometric registration systems in these refugee camps, and I'd like to ask you the difference between sort of analog registration systems and other forms of identity and digital registration systems and identity management systems. Where do you see the specific benefits in moving from the one to the other?
Very quickly, it's one is much more accountable than the other. Where we've introduced biometrics, and just from a straight accountability for resources which have been allocated to us, and I must add that we're at a time when there's less resources being provided for humanitarian operations when actually the needs are going up. And so we have to do whatever we can. So we have to ensure that the person who is, we have qualified to receive assistance, the most vulnerable, the most protected are the ones who actually receive it. And so through the biometrics, we can ensure that the person with that unique identifier is the one who receives the assistance. And where we have introduced biometrics around the world, we've usually seen a reduction in the numbers of, let's say it's deduplication or reduction in the potential fraud by anywhere between 17 and 30%. So the use of biometrics to provide increased accountability results in significant savings, particularly like when you look at operations which are spending anywhere $250 million per year. So if you can make savings of 10% plus, this is significant, which can then be redirected to the most vulnerable. Also, refugees are finding that when they have biometrics, they are less intimidated by other groups to give up their ration cards or to possibly make false claims. And so we found that refugees actually want to be registered with biometrics because that provides them with greater guarantee that their identity cannot be misused by others.
So I'm gonna move along the panel. I've read an article called "The Refugee Identity" from Paul Cuillon, leading up to this panel, and I want to quote from it very briefly. He says in the article, "The attack surface of the individual identity is all the points at which identity is vulnerable to misuse or abuse. Digitization increases the attack surface by linking identity data to other systems, making the refugee more vulnerable while decreasing the capability of the refugee to mitigate that vulnerability." Having heard what Andrew said and sort of the need for bringing in identification processes, but also taking that into account, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought up some really interesting points. I guess in response to the point about increased accountability, I'd be really interested to know what a digital identification system looks like that increases accountability, not in terms of the humanitarian operations, but accountability to the people who are being registered. And I think, it's fair that, I guess, in some cases, people are very keen to be registered in order to get certain access to certain services, but I also wonder, what does informed consent look like when you're saying you have to go through these systems in order to access shelter, access to territory, that kind of thing? Because I think, maybe this is an open question of whether there was an alternative system that didn't require people to give up biometric data. I'm also reminded of, I think it was November 2018, there was a group of Rohingya in a refugee camp in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh who actually went on a 3-day strike directly in response to the way that UNHCR was collecting their biometric data. So I think it's very context specific. They had some very, very detailed manifesto. They're incredibly well organized, but their points included things like not being consulted about how their data was being collected, not being sure who the data was being shared with, not having any alternatives. So they said that when they refused to give their biometric data, they were blocked from leaving a certain small area. And for me, that's very much not informed consent. And I would say that we all have a responsibility to kind of prioritize the rights of people who have been, particularly the Rohingya or refugees coming out of Syria who have been already so persecuted, to think about what their response and what their rights and what they want more than what would be potentially easier on the operational side.
And then I guess another topic that heavily comes into play is, as you mentioned in earlier, Andrew, the dynamics between the state actors and different actors that come into play, maybe also private sector companies, which we'll get to in a minute, providing different identity solutions, but of course also the power dynamic between UNHCR and the countries you're operating in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to add to that is, and this is something that, so we've been doing some research around lived effects of digital identification systems in the refugee context. One thing that comes up a lot is what is the recourse for refugees or for people who don't feel like their data is being handled in a responsible way? What can they do? Given that UN agencies are immune from national legal systems? What are the legal accountability processes that anyone can go through to say, this was not done well, there was a data breach, even, something like that? It's currently very blurry, and maybe you have answers to this, as to what people can do to assert their rights.
So consent and accountability, are there other critical aspects that we haven't yet named in regard to data protection and identity management in these contexts?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me there's a difference between a digital identification system that includes biometric data and one that doesn't. We did some research in, I think, 2016, 2017, looking at the specific problem that biometrics were seeking to solve, and we found overwhelmingly that the problem from the humanitarian side was around reducing fraud and deduplication, like Andrew mentioned. But there were many cases where the risk of gathering that data was so huge, potential risk was so huge. And for example, in the Rohingya context, their big concern is that the biometric data that is being collected by the Bangladeshi authorities in collaboration with the UNHCR would be shared back with the Myanmar government, who are committing a genocide against those people. So for me, it's very hard to see the use case in which gathering such personal, immutable, unchangeable data could ever be kind of reasonable in response to reducing fraud.
Do you want to respond before we move on? Because it's also a good point to move on. But yes, please, Andrew.
Just quickly, the Rohingya situation is probably also, it happens in almost every refugee situation where people are scared, they're concerned, they don't want data to be shared, they don't know why they're giving up the data. And that was certainly the case last year. Like I went to Bangladesh a couple of times. I was involved in the registration, in preparing for the registration. The population coming out of Myanmar were obviously extremely traumatised. They didn't want to be forced back, and they did not want to be registered. But over time, our teams have been discussing with them, with not only just UNHCR, but all the humanitarian actors there, saying why, particularly for the Rohingyas, why it is so important to have an identity. And so now I can basically say there's at least 1,000 people and more people coming per day and being registered and seeking that identity. This was not the case 6 months ago. Because the issue of trust, you mentioned the issue of legal recourse. The legal recourse is important, but most important for UNHCR and others is the credibility. If we do not have the credibility with the refugee population and the trust with the refugee situation, with refugees and with the host authorities, everything else is basically lost. So having this feedback mechanism, having the trust with the communities is absolutely important for us. Can we do things better? Absolutely. And I think one of the issues that having a digital identity offers us is to make use of feedback mechanisms. How can we do this in a more collaborative manner, certainly not just from UNHCR? How can we have much more independent CWC community communicating with communities, feedback mechanisms that are independent and can actually report back to objective interlocutors about what is going on, what are the concerns of the population. So take that into account very much. Informed consent, we try and do as much as we can in that regards. We can do better, and we must be doing better. In relation to accessing services, accessing protection, everyone has a choice. If you look at biometrics, elderly people with cataracts often cannot have their irises scanned. So we look at biometrics facilitating, multiplying our delivery assistance protection mechanisms, but everyone has got the option to opt in or opt out. And I think this is one of the key areas. And again, all the reports and all the elements that you're raising, we take into account, and we need to take those into account. What recourse, again, goes back to the trust and credibility. So we need to be listening to the populations.
Trust and credibility, good keywords I'll take to bring you into the conversation. Balazs, your original involvement with the blockchain came from realization of how difficult it was to open a bank account for refugees in Europe. So I'd like to ask you to share that experience with us a little bit, your point of inspiration to get into this whole business.
So basically our project started during the refugee crisis in Europe from a realization that was just mentioned that I happened to visit a refugee camp in Norway, and it turned out that it's more expensive for someone to go into the city than for me to travel out, because I can pay with card just for the distance of the trip, but someone without a bank card, has to pay for the entire bus fare. And that was like, okay, they get like 300 euro a month and I can travel cheaper. And we had a long discussion, and the person we interviewed, been living in Norway, speaks perfect Norwegian, but can't have a bank account because of legal reasons. And that was like shocking, like this person speaks better Norwegian than I do, understands the culture better, but she just can't get a job. In Norway, you need to have a bank account to be able to sign a contract. So it was like, oh, this is like crazy. Like, we can't talk about social inclusion and like openness and everything when they can just have no chance to start. And so I was familiar with the technology blockchain, and we started to look into, could it be possible to create a solution that enables them to access our financial ecosystem and not like an alternative cryptocurrency based. And that's how we stepped onto the story of banking for refugees 3 years ago.
So I'd like to ask you, just as Andrew sort of outlined the different use cases, let's say, that you need an identity for you to outline the different solutions that are out there today. We've talked a bit about biometrics, but can you just give us a general overview of digital identity solutions sort of on the market?
Sure, but I think it's important to go one step back, and like digital identity can be a lot of things. So mostly what we are talking about are personal identifiers that can prove who you are, that are related to your persona, your birth registration, your biometrics for authentication perspective, but it's not particularly your bank card is a digital identity as per, because whenever you pay, you authenticate yourself towards a system, which is a payment rail, but it is also an identity. So like, mostly in these situations, we are talking about the lower levels of identities, which can enable the access to go higher into service realm. However, the protection of these different realms can differ and maybe should differ. And the question was?
The different solutions that are out there today,
so
from a technical perspective.
Classic. So like basically, there is a range of different solutions. One you might have heard is called Facebook. It's great. If you're willing to give up your data. From a technology perspective, the gateway to their system is an open source. Both Facebook and Google use the same technology. However, like they store everything that you do, and they collect even more that you don't know about. Well, we can argue very longly why is it not so good, their business perspective, but they are much more effective than any other identity service ever before. The largest government-issued system currently is in India, which is a biometric-based identification system, which they collected north of 1 billion biometric identities of all their citizens in roughly 3 years. It was an insane large government push. The only issue was that back then when the system was created, India didn't have privacy rights. There was like none. So donors of the system had access to data. And it wasn't only biometric, but like that was the bottom layer of India Stack, which was access to banking, access to insurance, and so on and so on. And so like donors of the system had access to the stack information. It has changed. It is better now, but it is still not perfect, which is a government system. There is like the Estonian identity, which many of you might have heard. This is a much better implemented government-issued identity. It has distributed nature, so it's not like one system manages everything. They created a system after their government got hacked, where the different institutions in the government communicate with each other. And sort of the hopefully next realm, which my company and a lot of other companies are standing for, is self-sovereign identity or self-managed identity, where basically data storage and data management are happening on user side. So the user is able to store data in a way that it's technically provable that he or she is the owner, and also able to consent data which is used for different service accesses. So what it would create, just a second, is the ability to access every level of these like different realms of services with different ways of using your identity. Because, for example, when I entered here, I had to show my government ID, but they are only interested in my name, but it had my actual number on it, it had my birth date, so I gave up theoretically a lot more information than they were actually interested or have the rights to be interested in. So being able to create subsets of your identity, which you can still prove digitally, which is much better than a plastic card, it can become extremely powerful if implemented well.
Okay, I want to ask you two more questions on this topic. So classically, the state, the nation state, is the provider of your passport, your formal identity, and you as a citizen get the sort of the general right to have one, but it's something that's sort of co-owned between you and the state. In this version of self-sovereign identity, is this something that you envisage happening on a government-supported public blockchain, or how would that exactly take shape? Who would be sort of the manager of the system, the provider of the infrastructure behind it, and how does the self-sovereign part actually work?
So I think the only globally accepted identity is Facebook and your passport. The passport is actually useful, but the problem with that, you actually don't own it. The government owns your passport, you are a user of it, you are subscribed by being the citizen, but if you are not a citizen anymore, it's not valid. And if it's taken away, you can't prove you ever had it. Andrew mentioned that like a lot of people had trust issues registering in Zatar. The same happened when they entering in Europe. There was a huge black market of Syrian passports because Syrians had a simpler way to apply for citizenship all across Europe. And a Syrian can tell a story that he or she is a Syrian, while a person with a Syrian passport can show a passport that he or she is a Syrian. So like trust issues are to both directions. And going back to my mind, which again, forget the question.
The question was, how does the self-sovereign part actually work? Like now the
yes,
nation
the
state
question
is the
was around
provider,
blockchain.
and how would it be a public blockchain? Would that public blockchain be state provided infrastructure? How does it work? What role does the nation state play in future, and where does the self-sovereign part come in?
So we're not going to go into blockchain because it's a technology framework. What's important to understand that self-sovereign identity doesn't need blockchain, and the blockchain technology needs self-sovereign identity. So like what but like many companies are looking into is only registering a public address on a blockchain, which is a publicly run infrastructure, not owned by anyone, but miners are creating security and upkeep for the system. But then only using that on-chain and then moving transactions in a secure environment, but off-chain, because basically a blockchain identity, which is using actively a blockchain for transactions, would be like tweeting your digital life constantly. Maybe no one wants to use it, but if someone, they can search for it. With enough knowledge, it is public. So Self-certain identities are just registering functions on a blockchain, but they're moving, hopefully they are moving off-chain to store and manage the transactions themselves and the data itself. So no data should go ever on a blockchain.
I'm guessing that some of the things you say would make some people coming more from the sort of public sector side or data activist side a little bit nervous, and I want to just try to take them apart a little bit. So. The sort of nobody owns anything, it's kind of a translucent thing, but there are private companies sort of involved in some way, or private persons who are minors. That seems like a very sort of convoluted space, which is a very different thing to saying, here's a nation-state government that provides you with your passport. So that's one thing that makes perhaps people a little bit nervous. The whole Facebook thing makes me completely nervous on a whole different level, but maybe we'll get to that in a minute. Sarah pointed out earlier already the question and also the dangers connected with traceability. There are many people in the world who might not want their identity to be a sort of a linear, traceable thing. So as you pointed out, I would be able to sort of say which bits of my identity I communicate to who when. But of course there's a fallibility in all technical systems, and the idea behind the blockchain sort of locking in an unchangeable way information about me, which could include my nationality, and that's maybe something that I care to hide if I become a refugee. How does that come into play?
So there is the ability to destroy or make these identities disappear in most implementations, or hopefully in most, because there is a new right, like a global right, the right to be forgotten, which should create a system where these identities can be deleted. My question is that if I want to be deleted from the German refugee system, can I do that under the right to be forgotten? Because it's good that the technology enables, but is a nation state under the right to be forgotten scheme? Or can I become not a Hungarian citizen anymore? Actually, I can't. You have to be a citizen of a country, unless you are a refugee. But I can't become on purpose just a refugee because it sounds fun. It's just sort of a side note. It's not only technology, but from a technology perspective, like it is all possible because it's like we create the technology. The end goal is like, what are the use cases we want to apply it, and how can we avoid creating the ability to collect everything that are related to these identities. So the blockchain is not that big of a question because hopefully no one will ever save any data on the blockchain which comes to identity, like at least like from like serious projects. So I don't think that is a biggest concern for this debate, but the bigger question is how we can avoid collecting this data, because if it's consentable, someone can just ask, please give me all your data and you can become a citizen. And then there is an incentive to do that.
But that's not quite how it works, is it? You can jump in if you like.
Yeah, I mean,
it's also making you a little bit nervous.
Yeah, no. I think the mentions of Facebook as the biggest trusted global identity platform is worrying. We can get to that.
Trusted.
I mean, your words, I think. I guess I mean, I'm not familiar with your company, so this is kind of a general concern I have with mentions of identity and blockchain, and generally actually the kind of conflation between a person's identity and an identification system. That conflation kind of makes me nervous. I mean, we started with the question, who am I? And I think for me, if you'd asked me, who are you 10 years ago, I would answer that very differently to how I would now. I think that part of being human is kind of the fluid nature of our identities and the ability to change over time, the ability to present certain attributes, to hide certain attributes, is an inherent part of being human and being able to interact with the system in a responsible way. And I think the biggest thing that came up for me, and Geraldine, you already brought it up a little bit, is this confusing accountability that I think I'm not entirely sure I follow. And I think, going to your point, I feel like credibility, but that accountability is a huge part of building credibility, that having objective or kind of external accountability processes to say this did not work for me is a huge part of building credibility and trust. And then, yeah, I guess the other, I mean, a big question that I would have around the blockchain or private company related, private sector involvement in all of this is GDPR, like data protection regulation. If you were to say, I want to remove all of my data from this blockchain or this company, that kind of thing, I have no idea how that would be possible, given that it's immutable.
Maybe that's also a question how you address that. Having been introduced last year, how has that affected your work?
The GDPR. UNHCR is probably, like there's other organisations who've probably got even more stringent data protection, including ICRC. But as far as the UN is concerned, UNHCR was the first agency to put in a data protection policy and guidelines going back to 2015. So all the discussions on data and refugee protection cannot be distinguished. Like we have to have secure data. We have to have privacy, not just in theory but in practice. Because again, it goes back to the trust and integrity of everything we do. If our systems get hacked and people lose trust in who we are as a protection agency, then that's goes to the core of our mandate. So when we talk about issues of identity in regards to privacy, many of the regulations, the policies, the practices that we've put in place going back to 2015 actually predated the European regulations. And so what I can say is that we try to be in alignment as much as we can. And everything, given the world is changing so rapidly, given the capacity to hack, given the increasing value which people put on personal data, we also have to be agile. We also have to calibrate our responses and our requirements. We've got a data protection officer, but we need more. Like we need to be much more serious because the capacity to intercept, to hack into systems is also growing. So we as an organisation who puts privacy and protection at the very core, we have to invest much more in our understanding. So I was quite genuine sort of saying, look, your studies are things that we actually take into very seriously. The recommendations are things that we try to put into account. We've actually got a data meeting in Copenhagen today where privacy and protection and how we can have more enhanced guidelines are in play. So for any new technology that we put in play which could have an impact on data protection, we have a data protection impact assessment to go through all these elements.
I was going to ask because I'm sure that's a very difficult thing to balance, sort of being open for innovation. I know that UNHCR has its own sort of innovation hub, let's say, and sort of ecosystem, and trying to bring in new solutions that sort of do a better service to the people that you are trying to provide services for, but yet having very little space to experiment, of course, because people's lives depend on it.
Well, again, I don't want to keep saying that UNHCR is a protection agency, but innovation is no use to us if we jeopardise that protection space. So what is key to almost everything that we do is to make sure that people are at the centre. We try and ensure that we move forward on getting feedback mechanisms in play, not just being UNHCR-centric, but across the whole humanitarian space. We look at collaboration, we look at making sure that we can bring things to scale. So it's not a situation where it's alien us to sort of look at innovation, but also trying to ensure that we've got greater data security and data privacy. What we have to try and balance is, particularly in an emergency situation, how can we do our job better? How can we improve protection? How can we improve assistance? And when it comes down to it, we have to ensure that refugees and others, including stateless persons, have a choice. So in the end, we have to give them the dignity, the trust in them that they will make informed decisions.
I want to leave some time and space also for your question and comments. If you want to start bringing them in, there are people in the room who will come to you with a microphone and probably also better see you than I can. So if you want to start raising your hands, I guess from now on is a good time to do so. Or maybe if I see correctly, there's a microphone stand here in the middle, and you could possibly use that as well if you want to step forward. So you're trying to develop solutions with your company that will come into this context. Like, how do you go about doing that? Just also in a practical way in terms of dialogues with organizations like UNHCR, or also with maybe people like Zara. Like, how are you trying to build those solutions?
So we are focusing a lot on research from technology perspective, and also we are actively like contributing to a larger knowledge group on supporting the whole movement. If anyone is interested in self-sovereign identity, we created a paper called SSI paper. If you search on Twitter hashtag SSI paper, it will come up with the German Blockchain Association, which is basically it's a support paper for like from every aspect why self-sovereign identity can be beneficial, what are the circumstances that it could be disadvantages, and how public agencies can look at it and can understand it. So anyone is interested, just go on Twitter and SSI paper. So that's like one part which we did, which was a really large work, but it really enables us to have an easier conversation, because a lot of what we do is education, and conversations to better understand every aspect. And just to reply quickly to Zara, how do you know that you are deleted from another system that's nothing to do with blockchain? Because someone told you it happened?
Because someone told me it happened, and because I know that there's huge fines as part of the GDPR if they didn't.
That's the answer. It's technology. There is a way to solve it and delete it completely, so you have no trace. I'm happy to explain how.
I think this is a general, like, maybe as a comment from my side, like preparing for this session, I have to say, like, I found this one article that I cited earlier, and then I found a plethora of articles that celebrate technology. And that is a little bit part of my concern, or perhaps also shared concern, that a lot of these ideas are seen from a very technological perspective rather than a human-centered perspective. And there's a lot of hope put in the technological side, but it's a little bit of it seems to have a little bit of a naivety attached to it, especially taking into account that there are so many unforeseen things. The question of function creep, how do we design systems today that cannot be exploited tomorrow? We cannot predict exactly how either politics or technology is going to develop. So how do we design for future scenarios, basically?
That's a pretty complicated question. Generally speaking, like, the community is, from a technology perspective, the community is following even stiffer than GDPR standards and privacy, and think of future scenarios which our regulators are still very far from to understand or to act on. And on the other side, like privacy is a big issue, but the whole conversation started on there is 1 billion people who don't have identity, but they also don't have smartphone or even carrier service where they are mostly. So like, what are solutions that can be delivered to them and have the future capability to become like part of a global self-sovereign identity network or an interoperable identity without maybe all the level of privacy requirements, but the ability to deliver at least some form of identity to people so that they can be registered, they can be missed from school, from healthcare, and then they can, as they develop their identity and their presence in society, they can actually access to other services that are built on, because currently no identity system talks to each other. So UNHCR's identity system don't communicate with World Food Programme's identity system yet.
This is such a tricky thing. It is such a tricky question that you brought up. And I am reminded of a panel that we did quite a couple of years ago on the topic of big data and developing context. And I remember you being very, very clear on the question that you cannot balance human rights like that. It doesn't work to say, but people need something more, so they don't get the right to privacy because they're hungry. What would you respond today?
Yeah. I mean, kind of similar to Republica 2015. I think I would actually be really interested, and this goes back to something you were saying earlier, to think about, for those 1 billion people who don't have access to a digital identification mechanism, what is the kind of digital identification system that they want? So rather than us sitting here and saying, you know what, they want self-sovereign identity, how do we get it to them? I would be much more interested in kind of the flip side, saying, for example, one thing that really surprised me with the Rohingya case was one of the reasons that they were striking was that they specifically wanted the label Rohingya on their cards. And in many other contexts, the idea of having a label of your ethnicity on an identification card is unthinkable and horrible. And that was I think, a very good example of how context-specific a lot of this is. So the idea that, I think we have to start with respecting people's rights, respecting their dignity, starting from that place, asking them what kind of system makes sense for them in their context. Why do they need a digital identification card? What are the problems that they are trying to solve? Or what are the barriers that are standing in their way that a digital identification system of some kind could solve for them? But I think anything that is kind of us saying, you know what, you actually need this more than you need your right to privacy, it just seems very colonial to me.
Andrew?
I think we often like we're seeing it more and more. Like the days of old when refugees would come across into a refugee camp and be registered by UNHCR are fast disappearing. It's still the case. You have situations such as in Myanmar. Refugees coming across into Bangladesh, they don't really have any choice. They came to Kutupalong camp. They had a very rough registration to begin with because they were concerned, plus you had 800,000 people come. But more and more it's becoming more of a context that we're seeing of populations going through, say from the Sahel to North Africa towards Europe, or from the Venezuela situation. People are bypassing traditional registration and they're looking for their own solutions. And so more and more we have to not come from like a northern Western UN perspective to sort of say this is what you should have as far as an identity, and this is the type of technology that we will use. We have to adapt and sort of say, okay, what is it that you want? What is it that you need? What is the minimum viable data we need in order to better protect and assist you? And how can we work with others to ensure that you are in the best position to achieve your goals in a more dignified way? Because like, if you go back to the situation that we're being faced with the Syrian crisis in regards to Europe, when we had so many people going towards Europe in 2015, 2016, every academic institution or geek basically came up with their own app to sort of communicate with refugees. Most of them were useless, most of them were not trusted, most of them were irrelevant to refugees because we tried to sort of say, this is what they need to better communicate. Like what refugees will choose is what's useful for them. They will use WhatsApp, they may use Facebook, but then if Facebook is lost its credibility, then they'll go to Viber. They will go to Telegram. They will use what they believe is most important for them. So it goes back to saying digital identity is needed for populations as a basis. But what's more important is that that digital identity is protected and is put in a manner which is of most use to the individual.
Yeah. Thank you. Do you want to respond quickly?
Oh, no, I mean, I was just going to say, I totally agree with what you were saying, and some of the research that we're doing right now is looking into, precisely what are those lived effects that are sometimes hard to see if we're not kind of specifically looking for them.
We have an intervention question. If I can see correctly, it's this conversation here today very much builds on a conversation we had last year on the same stage, actually. And Kar Steinacker was one of the panelists then, also from UNHCR. Please, Kar.
Continuation of last year's discussion, even for those who weren't there last year. But what I realize no longer being with UNHCR is that obviously it's a niche discussion. It's because we are talking about digital identity about refugees, which are very vulnerable, and therefore it has its merits. However, I believe that maybe the organizers of Republica 2020 maybe should be thinking of having a broader discussion on digital identity, because I am of the opinion that there are new regulations coming. Everyone talks about GDPR, but the European countries, for instance, have allowed have new regulations coming. Where, for instance, the digital private companies, identity companies, will be accredited and have the right to operate. There is another regulation coming which will allow financial services provider to run all your bank accounts, your Google Pays, your Apple Pays, and this and that. And I would think that most of us, 10 years from now, will be subscribing to a digital identity company who will manage for us our digital identity. And what is happening right now is that business models are being sought left, right, and center. How this could be done and how could be this beneficial to the companies, obviously. And maybe blockchain comes very often across, and especially this idea of self-sovereign, that, this is, we are at last realizing the promise of the internet, the sovereign internet, the free internet for everybody. And I think what is really happening, if you look at the big companies who are doing research there, that is exactly the same thing is happening again. That the very big companies are researching digital identity, how digital identity can be sold to each of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. That was very important points that you raised there. You were nodding, you were looking concerned. Can you let us know a little bit more about this EU biometric system that's being introduced?
So one step back to regulations. The EU is introducing or working on a proposal to create a EU-wide refugee registration biometric system. With all the consent that they would need, as their decision is a nation-state level decision, without regards of how can someone opt out of this system, and while talking about the Chinese credit scoring system, how bad it is. So there is nothing black and white. Even the West is creating systems that are extremely violent towards privacy, especially of refugees, just because when you put the terrorism on anything, it becomes like a very different topic. And unfortunately, the case of refugees very often mixed with the potential effect of terrorism. Regarding the question, the quote, I do agree with this. UNHCR has the potential to become an identity provider from a very different perspective as of delivering these identities, often very complicated as technology is not present, whereas some of those companies that the gentleman might have meant are mostly operating in environments with very excessive access to technology.
So, as we have already nearly reached the end of our panel, I'd like to ask you all for sort of some closing remarks. Carl gave a look into the future, which maybe not all of us would feel is quite bright, with identity being managed by a set of different or a field of different private sector companies. Looking ahead into the future and what we want in terms of digital identity management, although I would very much like to take into account what you said, Zara, and I feel like we could also offer a platform here for some more inclusive discussions involving people who might be in a better position to answer this question than us here on the panel today. But looking into the future, the digital identity solutions that we'd want, what is it that we'd wish for? What would be your wishes to perhaps Zara, the people developing such solutions or managing and implementing such solutions? Same question for you, Andrew, and also for you. Would you like to start?
I'm happy to start. So generally speaking, privacy is becoming a new issue, much more people realizing that privacy is much more important than I can open a browser and I can do whatever I want, because you leave traces and there are people collecting those traces, or there are companies collecting those traces. So access to privacy and being the ability to live in an environment when there are regulations around your privacy to protect you is very, very important. And for that, you also need the ability to manage these traces and your privacy, so you need an identity management which has to align or even deliver higher standards than the regulation itself. And I would say this is what we are working towards, with the addition of how can it be delivered to situations which are not highly technically advanced yet.
Thank you. Zara?
Sure. I think for me, I'd start with a really clear problem definition, and that driven by kind of operational needs, but also by the context and by the people who will be part of or who will be registered under that identification system. Thinking about the minimum viable, the minimum viable amount of data that needs to be collected, and also data retention. How long does that need to be stored, and how can that be deleted after that period of time is over? Very limited data sharing. I think actually kind of in contrast to what was being said earlier, the fact that these systems don't talk to each other for me is kind of reassuring sometimes. I think it's fine that they don't always share all of the data all of the time. And then, I guess building in, kind of recognizing the amount of power that we have in even talking about kind of designing these systems and implementing these systems, and instead creating ways, kind of as Andrea was saying, to not just to do more than kind of hear in a feedback loop, but to give that power to the people who are going to be within that system.
Andrew.
There's a lot of work already being done in regards to the principles in regards to identity, in regards to data security, but it goes down to what is it in the interest of the individual. And it's concerning, like what has happened on the 18th of April with the adoption by Parliament of these rules and regulations within Europe, because can somebody, as has been discussed, can somebody be forgotten? Like, are the principles that we are so, like, including Europe, is pushing for so much, have they adopted them themselves within their own guidelines? So I don't know. I doubt it. I think there's much more issues in regards to security, in regards to control, than what is maybe necessary. Like, if you look at the lawfulness, if you look at the specific purpose, if you look at the accuracy, the quality, the ability for refugees and others to update their own information, who owns the data? Who owns the identity? And I suppose that's the crux of it. And if you're working for people, if you're working for the individual has to own the data. They have to elect when it's the right for somebody else to use that data, and not be sold, not be commercialized, not be used for nefarious purposes.
Thank you so much. I think that is a wonderful statement to end this panel on. And I would very much like to continue this discussion with you, hopefully next year, and take Carl's incentive to do so. I'd like to thank our partners from BMZ and GIZ for enabling this discussion here today, and the three of you for this interesting panel. I hope you enjoy the rest of Republica.
We